Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Physiology Secrets Podcast, episode 66. We had a question on our mastermind group that we did want to cover off today, a really good one from Mark, and it's talking about fuel utilisation throughout different types of activity. And he gave a really specific example of being in a fasted state. So his question on the mastermind group that we're going to talk through today is, given the crossover point of using carbohydrates and fats as our predominant fuel sources, generally happens about 65% of our VO2 max. What would happen if he, first of all, performed a high intensity workout above 65% of his VO2 max in a fasted state? So we're assuming maybe first thing in the morning, hasn't eaten anything from the night before. And then what's going to happen to our fuel utilisation? Are we going to use fats as our predominant fuel source even above that 65% crossover? Or are we still going to find carbs from somewhere? So just take me through what process is of fuel utilisation first, and then how it relates to that.
Yeah, cool.
State.
So basically there's 4 fuels that we can use in total. Let's go through that first. So there's 3 food fuels and 1 chemical. So we've got obviously carbohydrates and fat, as well as protein. Protein's only used in extreme circumstances. If we have no carbs, we have no fat. We may start to use a bit of protein, but this is generally if we're literally stuck out in the wilderness for 2 weeks and have nothing left and we're starved, we might start to actually use some protein. 1 chemical fuel is phosphocreatine, which is our sprinting, less than 10 seconds of high intensity activity. We're going to use the phosphocreatine. So the crossover point refers to, it's basically, we're in prolonged continuous submaximal exercise, we're using a combination of carbs and fats. So the crossover point is basically when we go from using fats predominantly, which is this hand here, fats predominantly, to switching over to using carbohydrates predominantly. 65% in the research is generally accepted, 65% of VO2 max is generally accepted as being that crossover point. It can vary individually, genetics obviously play a part, but it's normally about 65% VO2 max. Essentially the way that the body decides whether it's going to use a carbohydrate or a fat is purely to do with oxygen availability and the time that we have. Okay, so fat takes about 2.5 times more oxygen to metabolize than a carbohydrate, so it also takes about 2.5 times longer. It goes through a process called beta oxidation, which is, I'm not going to go into the details of it, but beta oxidation, it needs to break down fat and it takes a lot of time and oxygen to do that, whereas a carbohydrate just needs to go through glycolysis, which is but a much more simpler process. It takes less oxygen and less time. So when we're at a low intensity, like right now, both of us, we're using predominantly fat, probably about 98% of our usage is fat because our oxygen demand is very low, we're at rest, so we have plenty of oxygen supply, we have lots of time, so we're going to try to use fat as our primary source because an average individual, a lean 70 kilo athlete has about 100,000 calories of stored fat, but only has about 2 to maybe 2,500 calories of stored carbohydrates. So we actually do want to use fat when we can. And we can right now because our intensity is so low, we're at rest, we have the time to do so. When we start to increase our intensity, because fat takes more oxygen to metabolize, we start to preferentially use carbohydrates, and it's normally at about that 65% mark that we sort of start to see that crossover point. When we're at lactate threshold or lactate inflection point or VO2 max, either of those 2 points, we're actually using 100% carbohydrate. Because if you think about it, our exercise intensity is maximal. Our oxygen demand is right at the top. Our supply can only just meet it. We're not going to take 2.5 times longer or use 2.5 times more oxygen to burn a fat. We're going to go straight to the most readily available and easy to use fuel source, which is a carbohydrate. So that's a little bit of background about the biochemistry of fat versus carbs. So to address point number 1 of his question.
Yeah, high intensity workouts in a fasted state. So obviously going above that crossover point we discussed.
Yep.
Does it change our fuel utilisation? Really is the core of the question.
Yeah, cool. So in a fasted state, number 1, you don't have glycogen depletion in a fasted state. Okay, so if you, I'll come into ketosis and the concept around that in a sec, but if you eat some food throughout the day and then you go to sleep and then you wake up and you just choose to exercise without having breakfast, it's not like you're not going to have any carbohydrate. You're still going to have glycogen source. Yep. The only fuel source your brain can use is glucose, which is a carbohydrate. So regardless of ketosis, regardless of your diet, your body always is going to have some glucose, which is just the free form of glycogen. You're going to have carbohydrates. You can't live without it. If you're in a fasted state, you're going to have less glycogen. So let's just say, for example, as I said before, a 70 kilo athlete might have 2,000 calories worth of stored carbohydrate, of glycogen. If you're in a fasted state, let's say maybe you wake up with 800, for example. All right, so you now have a half tank, just under half a tank of carbohydrate, of glycogen. So if you go above 65% VO2 max, that's not a problem. You're still going to use close enough to the same rate of glycogen. You're just going to run out of it quicker or more quickly. So you might start to feel very fatigued after an hour instead of 2 hours, because essentially you're working with half a tank. If you're just cruising along at 50% VO2 max, I know that's not the question, but if you're just cruising along at 50% VO2 max, you're not really going to be using many carbs in the first place because the intensity is low. You have plenty of oxygen to metabolize fat in the first place, so you won't feel it as much. So a zone 2 effort, for example, no stress. Repeated high intensity efforts, I don't really care who you are, you're not going to do as well. Yeah, like if you're just doing a half an hour session, you've probably got plenty of carbohydrates to get through half an hour. But if you're doing like a marathon, for example, and you're doing a 3-hour marathon, you don't want to start with half a tank. You're going to hit the wall quite quickly. And hitting the wall, the term hitting the wall is genuinely, it literally is the process of running out of carbohydrates. Yeah. You can still go forever, but what happens when you hit the wall? You run out of carbohydrates, your intensity drops significantly, almost to a walk. You can still go for a very long time, but now because you're solely reliant on fat, that exercise intensity actually drops about 2.5 times because it takes 2.5 times longer, 2.5 times more oxygen to metabolize the fat. So to answer the question, you'll still be able to do it, but not for as long, essentially. So I might happy for me to go into ketosis a bit now. I
think that's probably the next sort of lead on to this is we get asked a bit about, well, is it then worth it to do these workouts in a faster state? Is it actually going to change? Am I going to become sort of fat adapted? Is a common term thrown around. Is that better for long endurance type events? You hear it thrown around a bit. Ketosis is a word that gets thrown around. Mm-hmm. Do you want to just go into a little bit about what people are sort of talking about there? Does it relate? Does it actually improve us? Or is it not really worth it? Yeah,
I mean, let's have a chat about it. And look, it's one of those high study areas at the moment. There's lots of research being done on the effects of ketosis and performance. 19 out of 20 studies that you'll read actually say that ketosis does not improve performance. I'd say 100% of them say it doesn't improve performance above about 80% VO2 max, which is probably FTP, which makes sense because you're almost using solely carbohydrates at that intensity. So it's not going to be beneficial to back off on the carbohydrates. Where it's kind of interesting where the research with ketosis is going is to do with ultra distance marathon runners. Okay, where you're not even probably close to 65%. You're probably 50%, maybe even 45 to top end 60% VO2 max.
Really low intensity.
For like 24 hours plus. And that's where the research is coming into it. But let's talk about ketosis. So the theory around ketosis is basically if you starve yourself of carbohydrates, you're allowed to have a little bit, but not much. You're basically having very minimal carbohydrate and you're replacing it with a high-fat diet. So because fat obviously doesn't have carbohydrates in it. So by starving your body of carbohydrates, your body will release ketones. Now the theory behind ketones is that that's essentially going to replace a carbohydrate. Okay, so instead of using carbohydrates for glycolysis, you'll use ketones. Okay, and so far the research shows that that's not the case because it has different chemical properties and it's still has to undergo beta oxidation. So it hasn't quite worked that way in a sense. Now, a lot of people watching today have probably seen the FASTER study where they had basically, long story short, they had a high carb group and a high fat group. They put them through an exhaustive treadmill test and measured their fat oxidation based on RER, so oxygen in, carbon dioxide out, so based on RER. What they found was that just prior to doing the intervention, so doing the exercise test, they gave the high carb group a high sugary drink and they gave the high fat group not a sugary drink, something very low in sugar. And they found that the high fat group were able to burn a much larger percentage of fat during that intervention than the high carb group. So they assumed that, carbs must be the enemy, that the carbs must actually inhibit your fat burning. But that's not the case. And it's not news that it's actually insulin that is going to inhibit your fat burning. So the way that insulin is released when you eat a carbohydrate. So when you actually consume it. So if you have a gel or a sports drink that has high sugar, your body will release insulin and that insulin will inhibit your fat burning. That's not news. That's been around for years and years and years. So what I'm trying to get at is not actually the presence of carbohydrate which is going to inhibit your fat burning. It's actually the presence of insulin. So what does that mean in terms of performance? Well, all it really means is that you need to control your insulin levels. particularly if you're doing like an ultra distance where, look, a marathon, a half Ironman, etc., you can sort of get away with just consuming gels. I always say once you start consuming gels, you need to keep consuming them because now you've suppressed your fat burning. So ultra distance, in theory, like all you have to do is you can still carb load, it's not a problem. Get the carbs in, like how long does insulin stay in the system for, wouldn't be more than about 3 hours really, like in terms of elevated insulin. So if you have a proper meal the night before and you get up early, have a big breakfast full of carbohydrates, as long as you're not smashing down gels 10, 15 minutes, an hour prior to a race, you're still going to have maximal fat burning. And that's what we say to our athletes. I say, look, don't have a gel 15 minutes prior. Have your proper carb loading as normal, 2 to 3 days prior, have a good brekkie, and then in the 3 hours leading to a race, either don't eat, depending on how you are, or just have something a bit lower GI, like a banana or some biscuits or something like that. Something that's not going to get that really high sugar rush and insulin spike. So is it beneficial to work in ketosis? Like, I mean, it's a lot of anecdotal stuff. Like, people think that they go into ketosis and they feel better and they feel fitter, so they do it. And look, if that's the case, then go for it. That's not a problem. I mean, carbohydrates retain water, so if you go on a ketosis diet for even a week to 2 weeks, you probably lose about 4 or 5 kilos of water weight. I'd feel pretty good if I lost 4 or 5 kilos.
Yeah, a little bit lighter, a little bit more efficient, so it's
a little bit easier to move around. But ketosis itself it's not going to give you more of a zone 2 stimulus or anything like that.
Yeah.
You could just exercise at a lower intensity and potentially play around with maybe restricting your high sugary stuff during training. Okay? In a race, you want to do it because you need to keep your glycogen stores topped up so we can work at high intensities close to FTP because you don't want to hit the wall. But in training, look, if you want to play around with what fasted training would do is essentially just make you use fat more from the beginning, but it's not going to help with your mitochondrial stimulus. And if you start to go above that 65% quite regularly, you're going to run out of carbohydrates quite quickly.
Quick, yeah.
So I guess sort of in summary of all that, carbohydrates aren't necessarily the enemy. It's really the insulin that will suppress your fat burning. Does that even matter? No, if you can replace your carbohydrates.
Yeah.
If you can't replace them because it's such a long event, or because you get gastrointestinal upset for even a half Ironman, then you need to get a bit creative and what are the options? Well, you can reduce the intensity overall. Obviously that's not great for performance, but at least you can finish consistently. Or potentially you could even just play around with different nutritional foods in the race. Yeah. Like, there's nothing wrong with trying a banana, which is lower in GI.
Yeah, try something other than a gel or
go.
I've tried with guys having a bar instead of a gel, a little bit longer to digest a bar than it is a gel, but it might help that gastric upset. Something as simple as that.
Yeah, so I mean, you might not have as much gastric upset. You still get the carbohydrates in. It's a slower release, therefore less insulin, which is good for your fat burning. So it might work well. And look, we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail of gastrointestinal upset and that sort of stuff. It's a little bit outside our scope of practice. We're not dietitians. But based on research, it's fructose to glucose ratio. You can up to 60 grams fructose and 30 grams glucose, and that's the maximum the body can absorb. But I don't think I've met anyone who can absorb that much without having to go to the toilet halfway through a race. So, so obviously we're not, as a philosophy, we're not massive on the ketosis thing. Would I ever use it at all? I mean, there are circumstances where you could, and it's pretty much the gastrointestinal upset stuff. I wouldn't do much pre-race, still keep the carbohydrates, but during the race I can definitely understand why somebody would want to reduce their carb intake during a race because it's not sitting well.
Maybe through the training side of things, you see it more of as a weight control type thing with athletes who are maybe trying to drop those couple of kilos, like you said, maybe with the water weight or leading into events instead of, maybe it's more of a case of is a low carb, high fat diet as opposed to the extreme end of it on ketosis, the better way to go in terms of weight loss. I've heard a few athletes talk about they use it more of that weight management aspect rather than sort of loading up on carbs all the time, and that could just come down to timing your diet again. Yeah,
you're definitely going to lose weight, but not fat weight. You're going to lose water weight very quickly by reducing your carbohydrates. 1 gram of carb is 3 grams of water. Fun fact, though. If you did reduce your carbohydrates, you would lose quite a bit of fluid there. I guess it depends on what your event is, because as soon as you carb load back up, you're going to put that weight back on, which is just the reality of it. But if you're a boxer or someone who needs to cut weight and make weight, absolutely, it's a good thing to do. Along with wearing your sweats and all that sort of stuff to try to sweat out your fluid. But Yeah, in most circumstances, I wouldn't really use it. I guess where the research will be interesting is going to be with the ultra stuff, as I said, and that's where most of the research is going. Can being on a ketosis diet or a ketogenic diet, is that going to improve our fat burning over the period of 24 hours? And look, I don't know. Like based on my decent knowledge of how glycolysis and beta oxidation works, I'm going to say probably not. But at least through reducing your carb intake during a certain event, you will have less insulin release, and therefore you will have maximal fat burning. And maybe when you look at energy in versus energy out, maybe either a lower GI carbohydrate or potentially keeping the intensity low enough that you don't really rely on carbohydrates at all, that might be where you see the major benefit in that long stuff at very low intensity.
Yeah. But again, it's probably still the question of if you're trying to compete at a high level in those really long ultra races, you still need to go faster at the same time to be number one, podium, etc. So there probably is a trade-off at some point, I guess, even in the ultras, that you want to still be working pretty hard, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean,
it is going to be a lower intensity, say, compared to a half marathon, for example, going out and doing a 100k ultra. But if you still want to be on the top, I'm assuming you'd want to still be working pretty. At the top level, if you want to be faster, you're still going to have to work.
Yeah, I mean, you're still going to have to move, but I mean, an ultra's going to be a battle of consistency and who can eat the most, really. So, a lot of the guys that we know, Beauty, for example, what does he do? Like, you wear a heart rate monitor and you say, I'm not going above X heart rate, and that might mean walking up the hill, because once you start to go above a certain heart rate, and maybe people had that metabolic efficiency test or whatever, where that crossover point is, they know that once they get to a certain heart rate, they're starting to really tap into more carbohydrate usage, which isn't going to be good over the long term. So I think ultra distance, we talk about the core components of endurance success. Ultra distance is everything. It's not just your physiology, it's not just your running economy, it's also your nutrition, your hydration, your motivation, your environment, lots of factors. So yes, you want to work as hard as you can while still finishing the race, but there's like 7 or 8 other factors which is going to determine who wins and who loses there. I think you're never going to run an ultra at 80% VO2 max. It's not going to happen. So how can you increase intensity as much as possible without running out of fuel, essentially? So it is going to be sub 65% for most people, but it's a bit of a balancing act. But in terms of ketosis alone, like I say, as a general rule, we don't use it. There might be some extreme circumstances where we control it. But as a summary, it's not the carbohydrate which inhibits fat burning, it's the insulin release. So if you can control your insulin release in key moments, such as before a race, in the first hour or so of a race, then great. But then if you're trying to race anything above about 80% VO2 max at FTP, you're going to need carbohydrates, because I don't care who you are, you have to use it. It's just biochemistry. So we start to take gels. Once you start taking gels, your insulin gets released. You start to inhibit your fat burning. What does that mean? You've got to keep taking gels to the end of the race, or you're going to be in a bit of strife. So that's sort of how it works. Yeah,
cool. Just last thing I did want to touch on with the ketosis stuff. It's quite extreme, isn't it? Just to sort of let everyone know how the difference between, I think a lot of people do get confused with sort of that low carb, high fat and ketosis being the same, but they're different. Do you want to just quickly touch on like the difference in terms of the extremity of how low that carbohydrate intake is for that ketosis to actually sort of take effect?
I'm going to probably get the numbers wrong here, but ketosis is it's really low carbohydrates, and I think, don't quote me, but I think it's 30 grams a day is of carbs. So that's like
nothing.
That's a soft drink. That's what it is.
Probably not even,
Well, soft drinks, but probably 32 anyway. So it's pure ketosis. Again, don't quote me on it, but I remember reading somewhere 30, another place 60, so whoever defines it, but it's a very, very low carbohydrate, which is then replaced by more protein and more fat. For your body to release ketones, my understanding is that you need to be almost not in a starved state, but starved of carbohydrate state for that to happen. Whereas lower carb, higher fat, hey, if that works for you, that's great. That's probably just a healthier diet. That's cutting out the crap, cutting out the sugar, cutting out all these soft drinks, and cutting out whatever the sugar, and replacing it with avocado and nuts and all the healthy stuff. So I have nothing against lower carb, higher fat, purely from a health perspective, if not anything else. But then when we're talking about a performance perspective, if you're wanting to hold a high intensity for as long as possible, you need carbohydrates.
And that's where you could get away with then doing your low carb, high fat throughout maybe your normal training, then carb load into your event to boost it up.
Yeah, I mean, just cycle it as well. Like you could do, no problem doing lower carb, higher fat for your zone 2 because you will be not too much above that 65%, and you'll be able to replace the carbohydrates you do use quite quickly. But if you know you've got a hard interval session, if it's 30 minutes, I probably wouldn't do it faster because you'll be hungry. But if you're doing 30 minutes, you'll get through with the carbohydrates you've got. If you've got a 90-minute or a 2-hour tempo session where you're right at or close to threshold or beyond, then, all right, if you know you've got that the next day, you want to bump your carbs back up because you are going to need that fuel source in that training session. So there's no problems with cycling it. But as I say all the time, it's just a balanced diet. It's not one trick. That's right. You just got to have a balanced diet, work for you, and just understand that the higher the intensity, the more carbs you will need. But knowing that the more insulin you have, the more fat you'll suppress. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah, working it both ways. So I think quickly in summary, in terms of the exact question that Mark gave us with the fasted state, high intensity interval type training, carbs are going to be beneficial in that session if we've got multiple intervals and potentially longer intervals of that really high intensity. If you're doing the longer, slower stuff, your really big ultra type events, that's probably when that sort of ketosis and the
may have
stuff
some validity.
may have some validity, but again, still sort of emerging in the research. We've got to sort of wait and see a little bit on what comes in the next little while. So yeah, really to summarise, carbs aren't such a bad thing. Just timing again. If you working that insulin release, don't go smashing a really high carb gel immediately before you start the session. Probably is going to hurt you more than sort of going to the session and maybe eating something during or after. So hopefully that answers your question, Mark, regarding what's going on with our fuel utilisation. Again, another great question from the mastermind group. So if you have your own question you'd like to ask, we'll leave a link below to join up to our mastermind group. You can click through and join the Facebook forum where you can ask all of your questions in there, have them answered on the podcast. Again, hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you in the next one.